Hey, it's Nathan. Before I tell you this one, I want you to sit with a small, ugly idea, because the whole story turns on it. Cruelty loves a tradition. Give a bad thing a ceremony, a name, a song, a "we've always done it this way," and people stop asking whether it's wrong. They just ask whose turn it is. Tonight's story is about a family that built a ceremony out of hurting boys and called it a welcome, and about the one man who married in from the outside and had spent 20 years learning, in the quietest and most patient corners of the military, exactly how to take a ceremony apart. Here's what I love about it, and why I think it's worth your time. The man at the center never once loses his temper on camera. He never gets loud. And that restraint isn't weakness. It turns out to be the sharpest weapon in the whole story. We're going to talk about how a person keeps their head when their kid is on a hospital bed, how patience beats rage almost every time it's given room to work, and what it actually costs to break a thing that's been protected for 40 years. Names and details are changed. The lesson isn't. Let's get into it. Russell Kincaid had a rule he'd carried out of 2 decades in the Marine Corps and into the rest of his life, and it fit on a bumper sticker even though he'd never have put it on one. Don't get loud, get certain. He was a raider, a critical skills operator out of the Marine Special Operations Command at Camp Lejeune, which is a fancy way of saying he'd spent his career being the calmest man in rooms where calm was in short supply. He was 42 now, with gray coming into a beard he kept because the beard reminded people he wasn't 20, and he ran a small marine diesel shop off the New River when he wasn't training or deployed. Boat engines, injectors, impellers, the slow, honest work of making a dead motor turn over. He liked it because it rewarded exactly the thing the Corps had drilled into him. You don't guess, you diagnose. You find the one cause under the 10 symptoms, and you fix that. He'd met Grace 15 years earlier at a farmer's market in Jacksonville, North Carolina, where she was selling honey out of the back of a truck and pretending she wasn't crying. Her hands were steady, and her eyes weren't. And Russ, who read people the way he read a fuel system, by what wasn't running right, bought 4 jars he didn't need just to keep standing there. She told him later, much later, that she'd left home at 18 with a duffel bag and a rule of her own: never say the name of the place she came from out loud, because saying it made it real again. Her people were the Braggs, and the place was Ludham, down in Craik County, a wedge of tidal marsh and pine and dark water an hour and a half south, where the land was cheap and the family owned most of it. Grace didn't talk about the Braggs. In 15 years, Russ had assembled them the way you assemble an enemy order of battle from fragments. Her father, Coy Bragg, who ran the county the way a spider runs a web, by being at the center and letting the strands do the work. Bragg Towing and Recovery, Bragg Land and Timber, a bail bond storefront, and the thing Grace's voice dropped to a whisper over, the Cedar Slough Boys Ranch, a youth program, out on the family's back acreage. Her mother, Darlene, who Grace said could make a threat sound like a hymn. Her 2 older brothers, Gage, the eldest, 46, built like a door, who ran the towing yard and the scrap and had wrestled in college before he blew a knee and came home mean. And Cash, 38, all fast hands and grievance, who trained at a strip mall MMA gym and had never in his life met a smaller person he didn't test. And behind them all, the family religion, the welcome. Russ heard about the welcome exactly once before it mattered. Early on, 3 drinks into a rare good night, Grace had said the word the way you'd name a scar, men's weekend, and then told him, flat, that every boy born or married into the Bragg line got taken out to the ranch when he was old enough, and got what her father called a proper welcome. They beat you, she said, not crying, which was worse, and everybody smiles while it happens, and afterward you're family. And if you say it was wrong, then you're weak. And if you're weak, you were never really family, so it couldn't have been wrong. That's the trick of it. It eats its own tail. Russ had asked what happened to the boys who didn't come out the other side loving it. Grace looked at the wall for a while. They leave, she said. Or they don't leave, and nobody asks. They named their son Luke, and Russ made a decision the day the boy was born that he never once revisited. Luke was not going to Ludham. Not for the welcome, not for anything. For 15 years that held, because Russ held it, and because Grace, who wanted it held more than he did, backed him. Luke grew up on the water instead, A lean, watchful, funny kid who could rebuild a carburetor by 12 and who had his mother's steady hands and his father's habit of going quiet and reading a room before he spoke. He was 15 now, all elbows and cowlick, in that stretched-out phase where the man he'd be was visible under the boy like a keel under a hull. He was, in every way that Russ measured things, coming along fine. And then, the spring Luke turned 15, two things happened close together that pried the door open. Grace's mother, Darlene, called, the first call in years, to say that Coy was sick, heart. Maybe a year, the doctors said. Though the doctors in Crate County said what Coy paid them to say, so who knew? And Russ got his orders. A training rotation and then a deployment. 4 months, the kind where you don't get a phone. He'd be gone from June to October. Grace, who had spent 15 years being certain, got unsure in the space of 1 week. Her father was dying and her son had never met his grandparents, and she was, underneath the rule she'd made at 18, still a daughter, still 8 years old somewhere in the back of her ribs, still hoping the people who were supposed to love her might turn out to have loved her all along. It's the oldest hope there is. It's the one they count on. It's a barbecue, Darlene said, when the calls became frequent. Just family. Coy wants to meet the boy before, no nonsense. That's over all that. We're old now, Gracie. We're just old. And Grace, hearing the childhood name, hearing what she wanted to hear, said yes, just for a weekend, just to a barbecue, with Russ deploying and unreachable, and Luke old enough to say he wanted to go, curious about the grandfather, the cousins, the whole vanished half of himself. She said yes. Russ found out from a voicemail he got in a signal window 3 weeks into the deployment. A scratchy 30 seconds where Grace's voice was trying very hard to sound light. Luke had gone down to Ludham for a long weekend at the ranch. It was fine. Everyone was being lovely. He'd be home Sunday. Russ stood in the dark at the edge of a runway on the other side of the world and felt something he was extremely well trained not to feel, which was fear, and he had no way to call, no way to reach anyone, no way to do anything at all except the one thing the Corps had made him best at, which was to wait and stay ready and trust that certainty would keep until he could act on it. He did not sleep that night. He counted the hours home. It's worth saying something here about who Russ Kincaid actually was, because the whole story depends on it, and because the thing that made him dangerous is the opposite of what movies tell you it is. He was not, by nature, a violent man. He'd been in violence, more than most people alive, but the work he'd been trained for in the special operations community wasn't the kick-in-the-door work everyone pictures. His specialty was the slow kind, reconnaissance, preparation of the environment, understanding a place and a people so completely that when the moment finally came, the outcome was already decided before anyone fired a shot. He'd spent months of his life lying still in hides watching a single compound, learning the pattern of a life until he could predict a man's Tuesday. He'd learned to turn sources, to sit across a table from a frightened person and, without threat, without money, just by being the first one to treat them like they mattered, earn the one piece of information that made everything else fall. His teams used to joke that Russ's superpower was that he was boring, and it was a compliment, the highest one they had, because the boring man is the one who's still thinking clearly at hour 40, the one who doesn't take the bait, the one who wins the fight 3 weeks before it happens by making sure it happens on ground of his choosing. There'd been a night, years before, in a place he still couldn't name, that he thought about now in the hospital chair. A local strongman, untouchable, protected, beloved by half the valley and feared by the other half. A man everyone said couldn't be moved. The impatient plan was a raid, and the raid would have failed, because the man had a dozen exits and 100 loyal guns and a story ready-made about foreign devils in the night. Russ's plan took 11 weeks. It found the strong man's own cousin, a man the strong man had shamed. It found the seam, and on the day it closed, the strong man was taken without a single shot, in daylight, by his own people, and the valley exhaled, and nobody had to become a martyr. That was the work. That was the thing Russ was, under the beard and the boat grease. And as he sat in the dark next to his sleeping son, some part of him that had been dormant in civilian life came fully, quietly awake, and began, the way it always did, not to rage, but to map. To understand what Luke walked into, You have to understand the machine the Braggs had built, because the welcome was never really about tradition. Tradition was the paint. Underneath was money, and the money is the part that matters, because money is what turns a nasty family habit into an organized crime. The engine was the Cedar Slough Boys Ranch. On paper, it was a beautiful thing, a court diversion program, the kind a judge can offer instead of juvenile detention. Instead of locking up a 16-year-old for a stolen four-wheeler or a fistfight, the judge sends him to a structured residential program out in the country. Fresh air, discipline, hard work, God. The state pays a per-child stipend for every boy in the program, month after month, plus grants, plus reimbursements. Coy Bragg had gotten the ranch license 20 years earlier through a bought inspector and had kept it licensed the same way. The judge who fed it boys was a soft, pink man named Ruel Peaton, who'd been on the county juvenile bench for 19 years and who owed the Braggs his seat, his lake house, and his silence. Here's the trick, and it's an ugly one. The boys at Cedar Slough weren't getting structure. They were getting used. The hard work was labor, clearing timber for Bragg Land and Timber, pulling parts at the towing yard, and, in a metal building at the back of the property that didn't appear on any inspection map, breaking down stolen vehicles. Cars and trucks and boats and outboard motors that Gage's tow trucks brought in abandoned, stripped for parts by teenagers who couldn't quit, couldn't call home, and couldn't be believed if they did, because they were court-adjudicated delinquents, and everyone in Craik County knew you couldn't trust a Cedar Slough boy. The state paid the Braggs to hold the boys. The chop shop paid the Braggs for the parts, and the boys paid for all of it with their hands and their years, and the welcome, the beating, was how you broke a new one in. It taught him three things at once: that pain here was normal, that no one would come, and that the only way up was to become one of the men who did the hurting. Gage ran the yard and the muscle. Cash ran the gym and the fights, because there was a second stream too. Bare-knuckle smokers out at the ranch on certain Saturday nights, betting matches, and the older boys who'd fully turned were made to fight in them. Coy sat at the center of it, sick now, slower, but still the spider, still the one whose bored, papery voice could end a conversation. Darlene kept the books and the appearances. Ott Sturgis, a leather-necked foreman with no blood in the family and no loyalty except to the paycheck, ran the day-to-day at the ranch and did the parts of the Cruelty the Braggs preferred not to touch themselves. And Sheriff Marlowe Skeen, elected 4 times, a Bragg cousin by marriage, made sure that in Craik County, the law was a thing that happened to other people. It had run like that for 2 decades. Boys came in on the judge's paper and left when they aged out at 18, scattered and broke and ashamed, telling no one, because who would they tell, and what was the crime, exactly, that a kid could name? They worked me, and they hit me, isn't a case, it's a childhood. Only one boy had ever really tried. His name was Rue Tolan, and he'd aged out 4 years back and gone to the state police with a story about a chop shop and beatings, and the state police had made one call, to Sheriff Skeen, courtesy, professional, and 2 weeks later, Rue Tolan's truck went into the Coldwater River off the ranch road at night, and Rue drowned, 19 years old, blood alcohol high, no charges, tragic, closed. His mother, Odetta Tolan, kept his boots by the door and had stopped believing in God, and had never, not for one day, stopped believing her son had been murdered. She just had no one to tell who'd listen. That was the machine. That was what a 15-year-old named Luke Kincaid drove into in the back of his grandmother's car on a bright Friday afternoon in June, curious about his grandfather, wearing a new shirt his mother had ironed. Luke's first day was almost sweet, which is how the machine worked. There was a barbecue, a real one, ribs and cousins and a great-uncle with a guitar. Coy, gray and shrunken in a lawn chair, had held the boy's face in 2 dry hands and looked at him a long time and said, "You got the Bragg jaw," and Luke, who wanted a grandfather the way you want a limb you were born without, glowed. Gage taught him to back a trailer. Cash showed him the gym, let him hit the bag, told him he had fast hands for a soft kid, which Luke took as a compliment because he didn't yet know Cash. There was a cousin his age, Presley, Gage's daughter, 16, quiet and sharp-eyed, who watched Luke the whole first day with an expression he couldn't read and didn't like, an expression he'd understand much later was grief, because Presley had grown up inside the machine and knew what Saturday was. That first night, late, Presley did the bravest thing a 16-year-old in that house could do, and it wasn't enough, and it wasn't her fault. She found Luke on the porch looking at the marsh, and she stood a careful distance away and said, not looking at him, "You should tell them you're sick tomorrow. Say your stomach. Say it tonight so it's not weird." Luke, who liked it here, who had a grandfather for the first time, who had been called blood at a table full of ribs and laughter, asked her why, and Presley couldn't say it. The words had been trained out of her, the way they'd been trained out of everyone in that family, the shame lock that made the thing unsayable even by the people who hated it. She just said, "Just say you're sick," and then Cash came out onto the porch and put a heavy arm around Luke's shoulders and said, "You're not sick, are you, cuz? Big day tomorrow." And Presley went inside, and that was that. Luke thought she was strange. He'd spend a long time later wishing he'd listened to the strange girl on the porch, and an even longer time being grateful that when it counted, she'd been braver than her whole bloodline put together. The Braggs were good at the day, is the thing. That's what nobody understands from the outside about families like this. The cruelty isn't constant. It's a spike in an ocean of ordinary warmth, and the warmth is real, which is what makes the spike land. Saturday was a good day. They took Luke out on the water in a John boat, and he caught a redfish, and Gage cleaned it and cooked it, and told him he was a natural. Coy sat him down and told him stories about Luke's own mother as a girl, funny ones, tender ones, and Luke drank them like a boy dying of thirst because his mother never spoke of her childhood at all, and here was the missing country of himself, narrated by a dying king who kept touching his face and calling him blood. By the time the sun went down, Luke Kincaid loved these people. That was the point. That was the design. You don't break a boy who's braced. You break a boy who's just been handed, for one golden day, the exact thing he's wanted his whole life, so that when the headlights come on over the gravel ring, he's too full of belonging to run, and so that afterward, bewildered and broken, he'll do the math the way they need him to, and conclude that the beating must have been love, because everything before it was. Saturday night they took him out to the ranch. Just the men, they said. Bragg tradition. Your daddy would understand. Your daddy's a warrior, boy. This is warrior stuff. They gave him a beer he didn't want. They walked him out past the metal building to a ring of gravel lit by truck headlights, where maybe a dozen men and a few of the older ranch boys stood in a loose circle, smiling, the way Grace had said they would smile. Coy was there in a folding chair, a blanket over his knees. And Ott Sturgis put a hand on the back of Luke's neck, friendly, heavy, and Gage rolled his shoulders, and Cash bounced on his toes, and someone said, "Welcome to the family," and it began. They didn't kill him. That was the discipline of the thing. They knew exactly how far. Cash worked the body, fast, because the body doesn't show. 3 ribs went, 2 on the left and 1 on the right, and the sound a rib makes is a sound Luke would hear in his sleep for a year. When Luke curled up, Gage hauled him standing to take it like a man, and an open hand caught him across the ear, and the eardrum tore, and the world on that side went to a high whine and stayed there. They kept it under 2 minutes. Then it was over, and they poured beer on his head and laughed and told him he did good. He did real good. He was blood now, and Coy watched the whole thing with the mild, faraway boredom of a man watching a chore get done, and when it was finished he said, "To no one. Every man in this family gets the same welcome," and had them wheel him back to the house. They cleaned Luke up. They fed him. They told him, and this is the part that would matter later, the part Russ would build everything on, that if he told his mother, if he told anyone, it would break Coy's heart in his last year, and it would prove he wasn't a Bragg after all. And did he want to be the reason his grandfather died sad? Luke, 15, 3 ribs broken, half deaf, terrified, said no. And then, past 2 in the morning, Gage and Cash decided they were done with him. They didn't drive him to a hospital. They drove the 90 minutes north to Jacksonville, to the house on the water, and they carried Luke up the walk and set him down on his own front porch, in view of the doorbell camera Russ had installed years ago and forgotten about, and they rang the bell once, and they walked back to the truck laughing about something, and drove off into the dark. The camera logged the time, 2:47 a.m. Grace found him when the chime woke her. She got him inside, got him to the hospital, got the diagnosis. 3 fractured ribs, a ruptured tympanic membrane. Contusions in a pattern the ER doctor went quiet over. And she called Russ's command with the words next of kin and emergency. And the Marine Corps, which is very good at exactly one kind of miracle, reached across the world and pulled Russell Kincaid out of a deployment and put him on a plane inside 18 hours. He came home to a hospital room and a sleeping boy and a wife who could not stop shaking. And the first thing he did was not rage. The first thing he did was sit down next to his son and take the boy's hand and be completely, unnaturally still, the way he got still when everything in him wanted to move, because he had learned long ago that the man who moves first in a bad situation usually moves wrong. And the second thing he did when Grace was asleep in the chair was open his phone and watch the doorbell footage. He watched two men set his beaten child on the ground like a bag of feed and ring the bell and laugh. He watched it once to see it. He watched it again to memorize it. He watched it, in the end, 11 times, without blinking, until the fear in him had burned off entirely and left behind the thing the Corps had spent 20 years building, which was not anger, it was certainty. Somewhere around the 7th viewing, in the dark, Russ Kincaid stopped being a frightened father and became something the Braggs had no file on and no defense against, and he thought a single sentence, quiet as a held breath, "My family does welcomes too." The next morning, Russ did the thing everyone does, because you have to do it first, because a lawful man builds his record. He called the Craik County Sheriff's Office and reported the aggravated assault of his son. He was polite. He gave the times, the injuries, the names. He offered the doorbell footage, and he got, from a bored dispatcher and then from Sheriff Marlowe Skeen himself, the education he'd expected but needed on the record. Skeen was warm as August. Terrible thing. Boys and their roughhousing. But the incident, if there'd been one, happened on private family land, and there were no independent witnesses, and the boy himself, Skeen had checked, was saying it was an accident, a fall, family matter, best kept in the family. "You understand, Mr. Kincaid," Skeen said. "You marry into folks, you take the folks as they come." Russ thanked him and hung up and wrote down every word, with the time, because a paper trail is just a fight you win slowly. Then he stopped making noise. This is the pivot of the whole story, and it's why I wanted to tell it. At the exact moment when almost anyone would have gotten in a truck and driven 90 minutes south to put Gage and Cash Bragg in the ground, Russ Kincaid did the opposite. He recognized the shape of what he was looking at. He'd seen it in a dozen countries. An entrenched, protected, locally beloved bad actor who couldn't be beaten by a raid because the raid was exactly what they were ready for. You don't beat a network by hitting its strongest node. You map it, you find the seams, you turn its own people, and you make the whole structure collapse under legal weight all at once. So there's no single door for anyone to run out of. The loud response, he told Grace, gives your enemy an exit. The quiet one closes them. He wasn't going to give the Braggs a villain to point at. He was going to give them a case. He made 2 phone calls. The first was to his sergeant major, a granite slab of a man named Dove Marish, and he asked for the rest of his emergency leave and whatever came after it. And he told Marish, plainly, what had happened and what he intended, the lawful version. Marish was quiet on the line for a moment and then said 4 words that Russ would carry. Go, bring them home. Not just Luke, them. The sergeant major had heard, in the flat way Russ laid it out, that there were other boys. The second call was to Zebulon Cardoza. Zeb, who'd been Russ's teammate for 6 years and 2 deployments before a bad ankle moved him into the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, where he now worked a public corruption and financial crimes task force out of the field office. Russ told Zeb everything. The ranch, the stipend, the abandoned cars, Sheriff Skeen, the bored old man in the lawn chair. Zeb listened the way Russ had listened to him under fire, completely. And at the end he said, Russ, if half of that's real, that's not a family fight. That's a federal case. Wire fraud, the state money crosses lines. That's mine. But you cannot be the one who touches it. You hear me? You go 1 inch outside the law and you hand them the story. You be a victim's father and a witness and nothing else, and you let me build it. Russ said he understood. He understood better than Zeb knew. He'd already decided that the most devastating thing he could possibly do to Coy Bragg was to be, from beginning to end, completely within his rights. Grace was the hardest part, and the truest. She had said yes to the weekend. She had let her son go. And now she sat in the wreckage of that yes, and could not forgive herself. And Russ did something that told you everything about the man. He didn't comfort her with a lie, and he didn't punish her with the truth. He said, "They spent 40 years building a machine to make people trust them. You didn't fail. You got beaten by a professional. Now you're going to help me take it apart. And when it's done, Luke's going to know his mother was the one who broke it." And Grace Kincaid, who had spent 15 years refusing to say the name of the place she came from, looked at her sleeping son and said the name out loud, and then she said, "I know where the books are." Reconnaissance is patience with a purpose, and Russ ran the next month like the operator he was. He did not go to Ludham. He never once let the Braggs see his face south of the county line. Instead, he built a picture from the outside in, and he built it with other people's hands so that his own would stay clean. Grace was the first and best source. She knew the family the way you know a house you grew up in, where the money was kept, that Darlene did the real books at the kitchen table and the fake ones at the ranch office, that Coy had never once in his life used a computer and kept everything in green ledger books in a gun safe, that the whole system depended on Judge Peaton signing diversion orders and on Skeen making sure no one ever counted the boys. She drew Russ a map of a place from memory, and Zeb took the map and began, quietly, lawfully, to pull threads a federal agent is allowed to pull. The ranch's state licensing file, its Medicaid and stipend billing, the incorporation papers for a shell called Slough Holdings that owned the abandoned vehicles on paper. He requested, through channels, the VINs of a sample of vehicles Bragg Towing had reported as abandoned and scrapped, and he ran them, and a satisfying number of them came back as stolen out of 3 neighboring counties, recovered, and then vanished into parts. The chop shop wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a spreadsheet, but a spreadsheet doesn't testify. People do. And here Russ did the thing that made the whole case. He found the seams, and instead of prying them with force, he waited by them with respect. He found Odetta Tolan first, Rue's mother, through an old news clipping about the drowning. He drove to her small, clean house alone and unarmed, and sat at her kitchen table and told her, flatly, who he was and what had happened to his son. And then he did the thing no one had done in 4 years. He believed her. He said, "I don't think your boy fell in that river, ma'am. I think they put him there. And I think if you're willing, we can make it so they can't do it again to anybody's son." Odetta Tolan cried in a way that scared him, and then she went to a closet and came back with a shoebox, and in the shoebox were things Rue had kept. A burner phone with photos of the metal building, a notebook of nights and names, and a list, in a 19-year-old's handwriting, of 11 other boys. 11. Russ photographed all of it and gave the originals to Zeb and touched none of it himself, because chain of custody is a kind of respect too. The second scene was Presley, Gage's daughter, the girl who had watched Luke with grief on his face. Russ never approached her. That would have been a grown man contacting a child, and he would give them nothing. But he had Grace reach out, aunt to niece, and what came back broke both their hearts and made the case. Presley, 16, had grown up watching the welcomes and the fights and the boys who came and went, and she had been, for 2 years, quietly using her phone. She had video, grainy, terrified, real, of a smoker fight, of Ott Sturgis whipping a boy with a dog leash, of Gage counting cash in the chop shop building. She had been keeping it because she didn't know what else to do with the knowledge that her family were monsters. And now an aunt she barely remembered was telling her there was a man who could use it, a federal man, and she could be a witness and be protected and get out. It's a heavy thing to ask of a kid. Presley didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting my whole life," she texted, "for somebody to ask." The third scene was the law itself, from the inside. There was a young deputy in Craik County, Renee Dabo, 3 years on, who had joined to help people and discovered she'd joined a family business. She'd found Rue Tolan's original complaint in a drawer, unfiled. She'd been told to lose a domestic call at the ranch. She was one honest person in a corrupt house, which is the loneliest thing there is. And when Zeb, agent to deputy, made careful contact and showed her that there was finally an outside, she flipped so fast and so completely that Zeb said she'd clearly been packed and standing by the door for a year. She became the inside eyes. She was the one who confirmed the smoker schedule, the one who told them when the state auditors were coming and going, the one who quietly photographed a diversion order signed by Judge Peaton with the date left blank, a blank check for a child's freedom. Russ had turned 3 of the network's own people without lifting a hand, and he had done it the way you do everything that lasts, by being the first person in a long time to treat them as if they mattered. The Braggs, of course, did not sit still, because bullies feel a shift in the air even when they can't name it. And in the 6th week, they made the move Russ had been quietly praying they'd make, because a cornered enemy who lashes out is an enemy who leaves prints. It started with pressure on Grace. Darlene called, honey and steel, to say Coy was asking for his grandbaby, that it would be a shame, a real shame, if family business ended up in front of strangers who wouldn't understand their ways. Then a Bragg towing truck happened to be parked across from Luke's school 2 days running. Then Russ's shop got a visit from the county, a sudden, hostile fire code inspection by an official who turned out to be Skeen's brother-in-law, red tagging the building over nothing. It was clumsy, and it was meant to be felt, and Russ felt it, and he did not react, and his stillness clearly unnerved them more than any threat would have. Bullies understand a man who yells back. They do not understand a man who writes down your license plate, times the inspection to the minute, and thanks the officer politely for his service. Every move they made against him, Russ documented and handed to Zeb, and each one became another count. Witness intimidation, abuse of process, another brick in the wall he was building around them. Then they overreached, the way the arrogant always do. Gage and Cash, drunk and certain, decided to remind the outsider of his place. They ran Russ's truck off a dark stretch of Route 9 one night while he was driving home alone from a meeting with Zeb, bumped him hard into the marsh grass, hemmed him in with the tow truck, and Cash got out grinning with a tire iron in his hand to have a conversation. And here is the moment the whole story had been building toward, the moment I want you to really see, because it's the difference between a movie and this. Russ Kincaid, a Marine raider, alone in the dark with the 2 men who had broken his son, with a tire iron swinging toward his window, and every justification in the world to end them both, did not fight. He kept his hands on the wheel. He kept his voice level. He let them scream at him, and rap the iron on the glass, and he did nothing but memorize their faces and repeat, calm and clear for the dash cam he'd installed that afternoon. You ran my vehicle off the road. You're holding a weapon. I'm not resisting. I want you to know I'm not resisting. Because he wasn't there to win a fight on Route 9. He was there to get Gage and Cash Bragg, on camera, in the commission of a felony, threatening a federal witness. They gave it to him. They gave him 4 minutes of it, high definition, time-stamped, with Cash saying the words, "You keep talking to that Fed, and we'll do your boy again, and finish it." Then they got bored of a man who wouldn't be scared, and they left, and Russ drove home the speed limit and uploaded the file and slept, for the first time since the porch, all the way through the night. He had them. Now he just had to close the door. There was one more turn before the end, and it was the kind that tests whether a man really believes his own doctrine or only likes the sound of it. In the 7th week, Coy Bragg, old, sick, but a spider to the last, felt the web trembling. He couldn't have named the case. He had no idea a federal task force existed. But 4 decades of running a county on instinct had taught him to smell weather, and he smelled it now. A daughter suddenly warm, an outsider suddenly quiet, a deputy who wouldn't meet his cousin's eye. So Coy did what cornered predators do. He decided to clean house. Word came through Presley, terrified, and then confirmed through Renee. The family was going to thin out the ranch before the end of the summer. Scatter the boys. Send the older ones to a cousin's operation 2 states over. Put the younger ones back through Peaton's court on paper as successfully completed, and shut the metal building down to a cold, empty shell. If they did it, the trafficking case, the human heart of the whole thing, the 19 living witnesses, would come apart in Russ's hands. The boys would be gone, coached, scared, scattered across state lines where a dead kid's notebook couldn't reach them. Zeb wanted to move early. He had enough, he said, for the fraud and the stolen cars. Take what's solid before it walks. And Russ, this is the moment, said no. He said it quietly, in a parking lot, to a federal agent who outranked him in every way that mattered on paper, and he was right, and Zeb knew it. If we move on the money and let the boys scatter, Russ said, we get Coy a white-collar sentence, and we lose the thing that matters. The boys are the case. The boys are the point. We don't move before they scatter. We make them not scatter. And then he laid out how, and it was pure old tradecraft. You don't stop the enemy's plan by force. You make the enemy choose to wait. Renee, on the inside, gently fed Skeen and Darlene a rumor that a state licensing auditor was coming through in early September. Routine, nothing. But you'd want every boy present and accounted for, and every paper perfect for it. Because a program that suddenly emptied out right before an audit is a program that gets a real investigator assigned. It was exactly the wrong thing to do to move 19 kids in the middle of. Coy, thinking he was being cautious, did the cautious thing, which was the fatal thing. He held. He kept the boys where they were, kept the building running to look normal, and moved his house cleaning to right after Founders Saturday, which meant that on Founders Saturday, every witness, every ledger, every stolen VIN, and every last member of the family would be in one place at one time, precisely because the family had decided, all on its own, that safety lay in not moving. Russ had done to Coy Bragg the thing he'd done to a strong man in a valley years before. He'd made the target choose the ground, and the ground was Russ's. The plan Russ and Zeb built was not complicated, because the best ones aren't. It just required everyone to be exactly where they were supposed to be at exactly the right time, which is the one thing a family of arrogant men who'd never faced an organized enemy could not imagine happening to them. It had two halves, and Russ insisted on the order. First the case, then the welcome. The law would take the machine, and only when the law had them boxed, only when there was no exit left, would Russ give the men who beat his son the one thing they'd taught him to give, a welcome of his own. Not a beating, something worse, for men like that. He would take from them the one thing they'd built their whole cruel church around, the illusion that they were the ones in control of the room. The hinge of it was the ranch's biggest night of the year, the Founders Saturday Smoker, the end-of-summer fight card and cookout where the whole clan and half the crooked county gathered out at Cedar Slough to bet and drink and watch boys hit each other. Everyone would be there, Coy and Darlene, Gage and Cash, Ott Sturgis, Judge Peaton in a lawn chair with a bourbon, Sheriff Skeen off-duty and comfortable, the shell company's paperwork in the office safe, the chop shop building running, and, the part that made it a federal takedown instead of a bar fight, the boys, all of them, on the property at once. Zeb's task force had spent a month turning the case into indictments, wire fraud and theft of government funds for the stipend scheme, a stolen vehicle trafficking conspiracy for the chop shop, forced labor and trafficking counts for the boys, obstruction and witness tampering, and, folded in among them, a reopened file on the death of Rue Tolan. The federal magistrate signed the warrants. The state's attorney general's office, humiliated to learn what had festered under a bought sheriff, lent its people. A federal prosecutor named Reagan Bly, who had spent her career on exactly these networks, and who fell a little in love with the cleanness of Russ's evidence, coordinated it all. And Deputy Renee Dabo, on the inside, made sure that on Founders Saturday, Sheriff Skeen would be relaxed, off radio, and completely unaware that his county was about to stop being his. Grace's role was the one that took the most courage. On the Thursday before, she drove to Ludham for the first time in 17 years, walked into her mother's kitchen, sat at the table where the real books were kept, and played the part of the prodigal daughter come home to make peace before her father died. She let Darlene believe she'd won, that the outsider had been managed, that Grace was Gracie again. And while Darlene wept and preened and talked, Grace confirmed with her own eyes the location of the safe, the ledgers, the blank diversion orders, and the timing of the Saturday event, and she memorized it all the way her husband had taught her, and she drove home and did not cry until she was over the county line. She had told Russ she wanted to be the one who broke it. She meant it. They did not tell Luke the plan, but Luke, healing, half-deaf on one side, had been watching his father move through the house for weeks with the quiet of a man diffusing something, and one night he came and stood in the door of the garage where Russ was working and said, "You're going to get them, aren't you? All of them." And Russ, who did not lie to his son, said, "Yes." And Luke said, "Not by hurting them." It wasn't a question. Somewhere in the long weeks, Luke had absorbed the lesson without being taught it. Russ set down his wrench. By making it so they can't hurt anybody again, he said, and can't ever pretend they were the good guys. Hurting them would let them off easy. I want them to have to be exactly who they are, in the light, forever. Luke thought about that a long time. Okay, he said, and then quiet. Dad, there were other boys there. I know, Russ said. I'm getting them too. Founders Saturday came in hot and bright and smelling of the marsh. Out at Cedar Slough, the trucks parked in rows and the beer flowed and the string of work lights came on over the gravel ring as the sun dropped, and Coy Bragg sat at the center of it all in his lawn chair with a blanket over his knees, the spider at the middle of the web, watching his boys run his world, certain, the way he had been certain for 40 years, that nothing in it could touch him. Cash was warming up the first fighters. Gage was working the betting. Judge Peaton had his bourbon. Sheriff Skeen had his boots off. The metal building at the back was lit and running. It was, in every way, the machine at full power, all its parts in one place, which is exactly what Russ and Zeb had needed. At 8:15, the federal and state units that had been staging in the pines since afternoon closed the only road off the ranch. At 8:17, they came out of the tree line all at once. No sirens until the last second. The quiet approach, closing every door before anyone knew there were doors. And the smoker went from a party to a raid in the space of a held breath. There was no shootout, because there was no time to reach for anything and nowhere to run to. That was the design. Agents took Gage over the betting table. Cash swung on the first man in reach, because of course he did, and added assault on a federal officer to his own tab and went down under 3 of them. Ott Sturgis ran for the metal building and found Deputy Renee Dabo standing in the door with her weapon out and a look on her face that had waited 3 years to arrive, and he sat down in the gravel and put his hands on his head. They found the stolen VINs and the parts and the ledgers and the blank diversion orders and the safe, and they found the boys, 19 of them, some of them the 11 names in a dead kid's notebook grown 4 years older, and they did not arrest a single one of those boys. They wrapped them in blankets and gave them water and started, for the first time in any of their lives, to ask them what had been done to them and to write the answers down. Judge Ruel Peaton was arrested in his lawn chair with the bourbon still in his hand. Sheriff Marlowe Skeen was arrested barefoot, and Coy Bragg, the spider, the founder, the bored old voice that had said every man in this family gets the same welcome over a broken child, was still sitting in his chair at the center of the gravel ring when the lights came up, because no one had bothered to run at him, because there was nowhere for a dying man to run. Prosecutor Reagan Bly had asked Russ if he wanted to be there. He'd said no. He'd stayed home with his son. But he'd asked one thing of Zeb, one small thing, and Zeb had arranged it, and it was the only piece of the whole night that Russ had staged himself. And it went like this. As they read Coy Bragg his rights in the middle of his ruined kingdom, an agent set a phone on the old man's blanketed knees, and on the screen, on a loop, was the doorbell footage. 2 of Coy's sons setting a beaten boy on a porch and laughing and walking away. And under it, the timestamp Coy would now have a very long time to think about. 2:47 a.m. It was the only message Russ sent. He didn't need to say the rest. My family does welcomes too. Their welcome had begun, and it had begun, in a manner of speaking, at 2:47. Sharp. The unwinding took a year, and it was, to Russ's deep satisfaction, boring. Because boring is what justice looks like when it's real. There were no dramatic acquittals, no last-minute escapes, because the case had been built the way Russ built everything. No single load-bearing point to knock out, just weight, everywhere, all at once. The federal charges held. The forced labor and trafficking counts, backed by 19 boys and 1 dead one's notebook, and Presley Bragg's 2 years of video and Deputy Dabo's inside testimony and Grace's map of the money, were unbreakable. Gage took a plea to avoid the trafficking maximum and got 22 years. Cash, who could not stop being Cash even in a courtroom, went to trial, added his Route 9 dashcam and his threat against Luke to his own sentence, and got 31. Ott Sturgis offered a deal, gave up the rest in exchange for the river, and here the story delivered the thing Odetta Tolan had waited 4 years for, because Sturgis, to save himself, told them who had run Rue Tolan's truck into the cold water, and it was Gage, and the drowning became a murder, and Rue Tolan finally, 4 years late, got his name back. Judge Peaton and Sheriff Skeen went down for public corruption, and for a boy in a river neither had wanted to look at. And Darlene Bragg, keeper of the books, went to prison for the fraud she'd penned so neatly for 2 decades, still insisting, to the end, that they had only ever been a family, only ever done what families do. Coy Bragg did not make it to trial, which some would call him getting off easy, but Russ didn't see it that way, and neither, in the end, did I. The old man's heart gave out in a federal medical facility 8 months in, alone, disgraced, his kingdom sold off to pay restitution, his sons in cages, his name, the name he'd built a 40-year church of cruelty to make people fear, now a thing that made people spit. He died having watched the doorbell footage more times than Russ ever had, because Russ made sure of it, legally, by ensuring it was Exhibit 1 and played in every proceeding. He died knowing his welcome had been answered. That was the punishment. Not pain. Pain he understood. What broke Coy Bragg was being made small and known and correctly named, in the light, forever, which was the exact fate he'd spent his life inflicting on boys, turned around and handed back. The Cedar Slough Boys Ranch was seized and shut, and the money clawed back from it funded something Reagan Bly and Russ pushed for together, real services for the 19, and for the boys who'd aged out before them, Rue Toland's 11, tracked down one by one and offered, at last, the thing none of them had ever been given, someone official, saying out loud, "It was not your fault, and it was not okay, and it was a crime, and we know your name." Odetta Toland put her son's boots away. Presley Bragg, 16 and finally free of the machine that made her, came to live near the Kincaids with her mother. And Grace, who had spent 15 years refusing to say where she came from, became, for that girl, the proof that you can leave a poisoned family and grow something clean. Renee Dabo, the one honest deputy, was appointed interim sheriff of a county learning how to have a real one, and the first thing she did was file every complaint that had ever been shoved in a drawer. And Luke healed. The ribs knit. The ear, mostly, came back. A little ring on that side in the quiet, which he said he didn't mind, because it reminded him of the difference between his father and the men who'd hurt him, and the difference was this. Both were dangerous, and only one had chosen, over and over, in the dark, with every reason not to stay in control. Months after it was all over, Luke asked his father the question the boy had been carrying. The one every kid in a story like this carries. Weren't you ever scared you'd lose it? That you'd just go down there and Russ, who had watched a video 11 times without blinking and never once let his hands become the story, told his son the truest thing he knew. Every minute, he said. Being certain doesn't mean you're not scared, Luke. It means you don't let the scared drive. Anybody can be loud. It's staying quiet, when everything in you is screaming, and doing it right anyway. That's the whole job. That's the man I wanted you to see. And Luke, who was going to be all right, who was going to be, in fact, exactly that kind of man, nodded, and the two of them went back to the boat engine on the bench, and made a dead thing turn over, together, in the good clean quiet of a house, where nobody would ever come at 2:47 again. Nathan here. So what do we actually take from a story like that, besides the very satisfying image of a spider watching his own web get folded up around him? A few things, and I mean them. First, rage feels like power, and almost never is. Russ Kincaid could have driven south the first night and put 2 men in the ground, and the Braggs would have won, because a grieving father who commits a murder is a story they know how to tell, and a patient one building a federal case is not. His restraint wasn't him being soft. It was him being lethal in the one way the law rewards. Second, cruelty protects itself with ceremony and shame, and both of those only work in the dark. The single most powerful thing anyone did in this story was believe a person nobody had believed. Odetta Toland, Presley, the 19 boys. Naming a thing out loud, in the light, is where these machines go to die. And third, the one I keep coming back to. The difference between a dangerous man and a monster isn't the danger. It's the control. Both of them can hurt you. Only one of them decides, every single time, not to unless it's right. If you've got someone like that in your corner, quiet, certain, slow to move, and impossible to stop once they do, you are luckier than you know. And if you're trying to become someone like that, start where Russ started. Don't get loud. Get certain. Thanks for being here. If this one moved you, stick around. I've got more. And be good to each other out there. It matters more than you think.